Thank you, John, for the introduction, and thank you all for coming out this evening. Beautiful night outside. You could have been in your gardens. You could have been doing a lot of things, but instead, you come to hear about the value of nothing. What is wrong with that? Okay, one in every audience. Just in terms of the title, it's one of those things that I have a focus group. It consists of two people, Elvira and Huli, who sit in the office right outside of mine. So when it came time to actually come up with a particular title, Paula was demanding that I get it in. Somehow or another, this one struck me as something very good. It's something I'd like to talk about anyway. We'll see how far we go with it. But then I got to thinking about it. After it got into print, first thing that gave me a little bit of pause with the title was that our chief financial officer, who isn't here this evening, Augie Hurt, he came into me and he had the poster, the value of nothing. And he says, "Oh, Tim, when the board of directors comes here, I think I'm going to talk to them about this." Now, this is the financial officer. So I said, "Augie, I don't think that's a good idea." They don't want to hear about the value of nothing. And then I started to think as well, okay, sometimes you give a talk. And, you all will leave, and someone will say, "Well, what did you do tonight?" "I went to hear a talk." "What was it about?" Now, suppose you don't remember the title properly. Instead of saying the value of nothing, it's like, well, it was nothing of value. So, anyway, I have a little bit of pause with the title, but the object of it, I think hopefully I'll be able to fulfill. This evening's talk, in addition to being about the particular topic, is also commemorative of one of the founders of the Theosophical Society, the Theosophical movement, Helena Blavatsky. You probably hear her name spoken a great deal when you come to these sorts of things. But May 8th is the date of her passing. And so, it's always been a custom throughout the people who have valued what she brought to the world to kind of celebrate that as a date to remember her. The tradition that she asked for, and she said, don't throw any parties or don't do any of those wild theosophical things that you all do. Just remember me in this way, by reading from two books, which we're not going to do. But one of the books was The Light of Asia, which is a poetic account of the Buddha's life and enlightenment, Sir Edwin Arnold. And the other book was the Bhagavad Gita, which is the classic little Indian text. But tonight, just very briefly, just to keep in the spirit of commemoration, just for those of you who have perhaps never heard of Helena Blavatsky or don't know anything about her impact, one of the impacts is that it put us all here together this evening, in the sense that she was a founder of the organization that is hosting tonight's talk. But beyond that, she was a person who lived for 60 years, 1831, 1891. And during that time, she's one of those folks who lived, about 8 different lives, it seems, in that very short time. The time she died, about 10 years before she died, they were calling her the old lady, 50 years old, which I'm sort of opposed to that point of view at this point of my life. There was a time when I would have concurred, but now I start to think that, like 80 is the new 60. But she was, first, she was born in Russia, and then she was one of these very exceptional people in terms of her clairvoyance and her ability to kind of see things that others around her didn't necessarily see. So that's great. But at 20 years old is when she had this life-changing experience of meeting this person that she had seen in visions, but had never encountered in a physical body. But when she met this person who she identified as her master, it was at that point that she became aware of a certain purpose for her living. And for the next 40 years, she embarked on that, which went into a deep exploration of the spiritualities of the world. It took her on travel through Africa, Asia, Europe, all three Americas. And this is travel in the 1800s. So it wasn't with United Airlines. There was no frequent flyer miles involved with this at all. She was in coaches and covered wagons. And then out of that came this effort to root something that could provide for humanity a different sort of vision, a vision about the nature of who we are, of our inner potentials, and of a direction, a reason that we're here, not just taking up space. And so she accomplished that. Theosophical Society has gone on for another 140 years almost now. And she's one of these people who probably all of us, without having ever heard of her, encountered the sorts of things that she made possible, in the sense that this opening of the spiritualities of the world to become available to us, such terms as karma were unheard of before it started being talked about and expanded upon through her and others around her. Reincarnation. These are concepts that were utterly foreign. This deeper idea that she tried to promote, and which is one that we're still trying to live our way into, was the idea of unity of the human family. Not just the sort of limited, materialistic, and selfish view that was normal. She's one of these people you would categorize as something like a genius. A genius in the sense that anyone who has earned the description of being genius generally is someone who sees beyond what we see. Often there are people who can see years into the future, things that are still coming, things that we're going to have to live our way into. And in her case, she was one of those people. You find in the history of humanity that there are always these great minds that bring in the next great idea. They say there's nothing more powerful than an idea whose time has come. And so you find these people that bring these ideas, and very often what they brings with it a certain level of discomfort. I mean, you take someone like Copernicus, really the father of modern science is what they would call him. He brought in this whole idea, which is just completely normal and acceptable to us, that in fact, the universe does not circle around the Earth. But the Earth is just one little tiny planet that circles around the sun. I mean, I say that here, and it's like, yeah, and? But at the time that he said it, he was very smart, actually, because he didn't actually say it until he was on his deathbed. Because they were actually killing people for that. That was a heretical sort of idea, to suggest that what's written in the Bible, that the earth is unmoved, the interpretation of those words. To say something like that would have gotten him into a lot of trouble. So he had thought all of this out, reasoned it through, and at the same time recognized it would probably be better if he released this when they couldn't do anything to him. So it came out at the occasion of his death. And so actually the date of his death is the date that people mark as the beginning of the scientific era. Galileo, who followed after him and tried to advance these same ideas, didn't fare so well. Anytime you have some great new idea that comes in, they say that there are 3 phases it passes through. And you can check it for yourself and see if maybe there's some truth to that. The first thing that happens is that it's ridiculed. So this idea that human beings are not the center of the universe, that idea was ridiculed. And then the next thing, as it starts to gain a little bit of foothold in the minds of people, the next thing you can always expect is that it will then be violently attacked. You know, whoever said this is crazy, you know, the idea is foolish, and then ultimately they probably end up killing the person. You know, you can't do much with the message, so kill the messenger. And then it gets to a third phase, where to everybody's mind, these facts are so obvious and self-evident that you ask why anybody ever even argued with it. And that's the history of every great idea. So, you know, you have these various ideas. Blavatsky brought in a particular idea that there are powers within each and every one of us that can in fact be unfolded, and that there's a certain knowledge that can be instrumental in that unfoldment process, and that the purpose of that unfoldment is not just to be, you know, wonderful and comfortable individuals, but the purpose of that greater knowledge or higher wisdom is so that we can actually see more clearly the connections between us and actually between all living things, and the fact that everything is living. So it's a profound idea, and she caught her share of trouble for bringing that in. But you have all of these great minds, and you have all of these great ideas. I mean, even in our recent sorts of times, you had ideas like you have democracy, which is normal to us. Wars have been fought over that because has not always been normal. The idea that we take as normal of something like human rights. Seems like it should be that way. We're born, there should be certain inalienable rights. But that's a 20th century concept. So you have great minds, and through those great minds, great ideas come into being. Then you would have what I would say you could call the greatest minds, which would be those spiritual geniuses, Jesus, Buddha, Shankaracharya, you know, those sorts of people. And in their case, you know, a great mind, you'll be uncomfortable because you have to kind of adjust, you know, your concept of self to the world that they're telling us about. So, you know, in a democracy now I have to take responsibility for the rights I have. It's a little uncomfortable. But for these really greatest of all human thinkers, the greatest of minds, what they bring is something more profound. Because they don't just slightly redefine who and what we are. In those cases, what you find happens is the very fundamental idea of a self is what they challenge. So, in the case of, say, Christianity and the message that comes through the Bible and through Jesus, it's a message that doesn't exalt the self. It talks about really oneness. In that language, it would be something like oneness with the Father who is in heaven. And so the focus becomes not just one of mere self-development at that stage, but one of union with the divine. So oneness is that particular focus. When you speak in terms of something like Advaita Vedanta, they talk about an absolute that is the only reality. You know, everything else is illusion. That's a view of reality that moves beyond any sort of idea of, you know, the place for the individual self, and that is a little bit challenging. And Buddhism, which we'll talk probably more about, has developed this whole idea that is difficult to grasp. But in Buddhism, what is spoken of as wisdom is also spoken of as emptiness. That there is no thing that's out here, you, me, the greatest idea that we have, nothing has any sort of inherent existence, is what they would say. So these are kind of difficult and profound ideas, but it's something that these great religious thinkers and spiritual beings come in to challenge us with. I've had this idea. There are a variety of teachers, and they teach a variety of things. But there's this image. When you talk about the normal sort of teacher and the normal sort of teaching, if you were to say that somebody, 3 people knew something about fire, the rest of us didn't. You could get one person who could come to us and say, fire, it's hot, it burns, it's good for cooking, you can use it in your home. And they could describe fire to you. That's one level of teacher. So that particular teacher is describing something, telling you about it, and then it's up to you to believe or not. You have another one that comes and says, look, here's how you make the fire. You rub the sticks together, and then it's good for all the things that this other one told you about. And so in that case, you have a spiritual teacher, someone who's actually talking to you about things that talking to you and guiding you in the process. Third person comes and stands before you, and instead of doing what the others did, this one bursts into flame. When people talk about an avatar or a messiah or that sort of thing, you're talking about someone who actually becomes and models in their life the thing that they have spoken about. So there's 3 different levels of teacher and 3 different levels of teaching that they're dealing with. But all of them seem to be talking about one central thing. And the central thing is a problem that probably we all are faced with. The idea that many people at different points find themselves asking of who and what am I? And just to give an example, I could take my case or I could take your case, but the example is this, that certain things, there's a certain problem that we have, and everybody faces the same problem, of actually trying to figure out why we're here and what it is that we're here to do. And this problem begins right at the moment of birth. And here's how it happens. If you have any sort of familiarity with any of these spiritual teachings that talk about the nature of the soul, or anything that embraces an idea of reincarnation, there's the idea that before the moment of birth, there is something that we can call a soul that exists before this body comes into the world. And the way it works is, at the moment of birth, the very first thing that tends to happen is there is something that happens when the doctor takes a look at you and decides whether you're a boy or a girl. At least that's what happened in my case. Looked at me, and for whatever reason, the doctor said, this is a boy. All the medical signs seem to point to that. And so this begins this process. So all of a sudden, I'm a boy. I may have used this example before, but I think it's something that speaks to the issue. So you get a gender first. Next thing that happens, you get a name. Next thing that happens, you get a whole family that you're born into, and that family has problems with other families. And you've got the whole family history. And so you don't go and visit certain people because they don't like us and didn't treat us well. So this soul that previously has no gender, certainly has no nationality, has no particular name. This process starts. It gets a name, it gets a gender, it gets a nationality, it gets a religion. It gets all of these different things. And from that point on, everybody starts identifying you as that. So in my case, everybody started calling me Tim. And after a while, I started answering to Tim. And then after a while, they started to say, this is Tim who is from America. And I started to nod and say, I'm Tim. I'm American. The soul did not come in with those categories. But you start being told one thing after another, and gradually it gets to the point that becomes what we describe as our identity. I am these things. And that begins a problem. Because from that moment on, we start to distinguish ourselves from others. And so, if the nation that I'm born into, that I have said I'm a part of, has a problem with some other nation, next thing you know, I find myself saying, yes, we must go to war. This body that is inhabited by this particular soul must go over and fight and kill and do whatever I have to do with the body that's inhabited by some other soul that also didn't have a gender, didn't have a name, didn't have a nationality. But this process, we start to buy into it, and we start to accept these various identities. That wouldn't be so bad, except that in addition to accepting them, the process goes further to where now we want to actually expand them. So it's not enough to be just Tim. Well, now I want to be famous Tim. Or I'd like to be wealthy Tim. Or I'd like to be deeply spiritual Tim. And so there's yet another identity that we claim for ourselves. And, not only claim, but we will protect it. If somebody comes and says something about your family, where I used to come from, that would mean a fight. Somebody talks about your family, it doesn't make any difference even if it's true. We have to fight about this because you can't do that. My identity requires that you don't do something like that. So it's something of a problem. So there's this process that starts, and the process goes something like this. Birth or incarnation leads to a next step. The next step that it leads to is this idea of identification. Once we're born, we start to take on these names and we start to expand and protect them. Once we've identified ourselves in this way, then there's another step. Because at that next step, then we start to find that, we find ourselves in conflict with all of these other people who have identified themselves differently. So then there's this level of conflict. And if this goes on long enough, you reach a point where you start to feel like maybe there's something wrong with this. The really crucial point for most people who find themselves attracted at all to some sort of spiritual path doesn't come in really with enlightenment. That's on down the road. The crucial point that we reach seems to be the point where we actually start to feel that something here is not quite right. There's a certain dissatisfaction. And perhaps you could even say a certain level of disillusionment that comes with this whole process that finds us fighting with others, seeking to expand this identity, feeling discontent when somebody encroaches on it, or all the various processes that go with this self-defense. So you start to feel that maybe there's something wrong with this. And that's a very critical point, because if and when that ever does set in, really it moves to the place where the possibility for freedom from this cycle first makes itself known to us. There are great examples of this throughout the world. I mean, probably for us, as a parent, I think I really would not want for my daughter to have to experience disillusionment. It's not what we like, because it always is something where it's sad. Anyone who's been in love and been jilted, it's like, oh man, I thought the world of him, or I thought the world of her. And now look, I'm never gonna love her. There's songs like this, I'll never fall in love again. Everything you hear on the radio speaks to this kind of condition of being disillusioned one way or another. And that's not something that you want for yourself. It's not something that you want for others. But probably when we think about it really, the idea that we find out here in all of the various spiritualities around the world is that it's expressed in different ways. But the basic idea is that everything that we see around us is essentially illusion. We see it wrongly. There's this idea that was expressed by a fellow named Dr. Charles Tart, and I like the expression he used, and I like what it describes. He uses the term consensus trance. That there's a consensus about what we're going to call real. And we all kind of get involved in that process to the point that I'm going to affirm it for you, and you're going to affirm it for me. And so everybody will be on the same page and think it's real. The King's New Clothes was a story like that. I saw a video on YouTube the other day. I wasn't thinking about it in these sort of consensus trance terms. You know how people send you these different videos, and most of the time you don't even want to bother watching them. This particular one actually was pretty good. And it took place in a shopping mall. Just one of these normal shopping malls, high level with Bloomingdale's or something. And the way they set this thing up, there was a fellow who came in, and he's dressed like pretty much any one of them. You might have a hoodie. He had a hoodie on, little baseball hat. One of these things where he had one of those razors that you shave with so it looks like, it's 3 days growth. And he walked around, and the way he set it up was he had 2 or 3 people in the shopping center who started talking to each other. Say, so everybody could hear. Say, isn't that? And then they named some star from The Hunger Games, this movie. And so as the people overheard him, they started to spread it through the shopping center. That's, Justin so-and-so from the Hunger Games. So you watch this video, and this guy who is dressed like any one of us in here, basically, all of a sudden, people are running after him, asking for his autograph. They had to call security guards from all over the mall. They closed down stores that he went into. And it's just you and me. He also had taken the further step of having some friend of his rent a BMW so that when he drove up, he could be seen. By the time he left the store, teenage girls had given him all their phone numbers. Somebody had given him some clothing to, he was signing autographs on people's shirts. And to me, it's this example of this kind of consensus trance. I am who we all agree I am. In his case, everybody agreed he was a star, behaved accordingly. And we find ourselves in a situation somewhat like that. In Indian spirituality, there's this example that they give about the snake and the rope. So the idea that they talk about is that the way we behave in our day-to-day life is much like the person who's walking down the road, sees a rope curled up in the middle of the road, and makes the mistake of believing it's a snake. And when he sees it, fear comes up in him. He's ready to run. Fight or flight is what clicks in. And then, if he gets a little bit closer, he finds that it's not a snake after all. It's a rope. And he's misperceived. They use this example to say that, in our case, one of the fundamental things that we find ourselves dealing with is not that we don't know. Many people think in terms of people being ignorant. And ignorance, we would say, is not knowing, when really what they're trying to tell us is ignorance is, and the ignorance we find ourselves suffering from, is not that we don't know, but perhaps that we know wrongly. We perceive things incorrectly. We think the rope is the snake. We think that the identity is the person. And it's an idea that we find it difficult to relieve ourselves of. So how do we do something about this? In our particular culture, I think we suffer from, we don't have some of the advantages that many other traditions do. I mean, I've often thought that in traditions like the Sufi tradition, where you have this kind of ecstatic dance, where they have the whirling dervishes. In other cultures, you have different things related to music. Native American culture, you had the vision quest. In our culture, we have no avenues that are provided for us to lose a sense of what we might call self-control. The closest thing we have to some sort of formalized ritual that allows us to go beyond this self that we feel must always be in control of things is Monday Night Football or something like that, where you have grown men and women standing up screaming at a TV set. But there's this avenue that we have closed off to ourselves, I think, that other cultures have. For actually, the experience that we tend to think of as the most moving, the most dynamic, are often those experiences when we find ourselves, for whatever reason, removed momentarily from all of the worries and concerns and pressures and controls that we put on our normal day. People who have experienced what's described as a near-death experience, which is probably one of the more extreme forms of this, what they always come back talking about is how free they felt. After they've gone down that tunnel of light and after they've been removed from the pains of the body, they talk about the level of freedom that they experience. And probably it's not because of the light or the actual experience of the life review, but it's probably more so because of this moment where, for just a few moments, they find that they are no longer within the grasp of this controlling mind, this controlling ego, this sense of identity that needs to constantly enforce itself on every moment. And so that's something that they come back always talking about, how they feel changed. And that's something that we have to figure out ways to provide for ourselves. In the spiritual traditions of the world, that has been spoken of. So what you have is H.P. Blavatsky, whose anniversary we are celebrating. She talked about a particular term. She talked about what it is we need to do is we need to paralyze the personality, which are sort of strong words. In the Bible, in the words of St. Paul, he talks about how absence from the body is presence with God. So the same idea of the controlling personality and moving beyond the grasp of that. There was a great American mystic by the name of Joel Goldsmith who spoke about creating a vacuum, that the process for us is to remove the obstacles that block us from the experience of the divine, remove one by one. In Indian spirituality, they talk about neti, not this. It's not the identity of Tim. It's not the identity of American. We ask ourselves who I am and peel away each thing that we are not, bit by bit. And so ultimately what we find revealed is, you could say, the life that is contained within that. There's this expression. They say that the person who is proud of their mighty intellect is like the prisoner who is proud of his very large cell. That there is something about us that we attach to these things, and then that becomes our very prison, the things that we think we are most proud of. So another particular approach, and this is related to this idea of nothingness, comes out of the Buddhist tradition. In Buddhism, probably the most repeated and most known verse is something called the Heart Sutra, or the Prajna Paramita Sutra, so the perfection of wisdom. And it's spoken of as a complete path in and of itself, that if we can really ever understand it, and through its practice, it peels away these various layers that we find blocking us from the experience of who we really are. And so, just to share with you some of the words of this particular sutra, which has been regarded as so powerful. The history of it is that it was given by the Buddha, supposedly, was sitting at a time when there was one of his disciples, Avalokiteshvara, was in deep meditation on this highest perfect wisdom, this Prajna Paramita. And at a particular moment, he got it. He saw what it was all about. And then he began his teaching. And he gave the teaching to one of the Buddha's closest disciples, Shariputra. And so that's sort of the setup for it. And so when he starts to teach, he starts to talk about highest perfect wisdom and how it's accomplished and how you too can accomplish it. And the way the sutra goes is, it talks about Avalokiteshvara, a bodhisattva, was practicing highest perfect wisdom when he perceived that the 5 fields of consciousness were all empty. So the 5 fields of consciousness are what are known as the skandhas. It's the psychological aspect that makes up our personality and our characters. So form, sensation, recognition, mental formations, consciousness, those are the 5. But when he saw that these things really had no real existence, they were empty. And then he said that what this did was it relieved every suffering to be able to perceive this. And then he goes on to try and describe what this experience is like. And what you find is, in his description, it's very much like anyone who has ever tried to describe these very profound experiences where for whatever reason they had a momentary encounter with truth, it ends up being very much the same. You know, when they talk about these things, it's always described as what it is not. So it's not this, it's not that. But they never really can tell you quite what it is. So he goes on to describe all of the things that wisdom is not. It's not suffering. You know, it's not the things that we touch. It's not the things that we feel. It's not the colors. It's not the sounds. He goes on to say that there's no such thing as nirvana. You know, there's no liberation. And there's also no non-liberation. Every single step of this description is one that is geared toward trying to strip away, layer by layer, these various sorts of identities that we have adopted. So the Prajnaparamita Sutra ends in saying that highest perfect wisdom is accomplished through this process of recognizing that all phenomena, everything that we see, is empty. There's nothing there. And to try and think a little bit about this, in a little book called Light on the Path, there's a little essay at the end where it says that just a little bit of thought, a little bit of attention to the ageless wisdom has great results. And the reason why, they say, is because once you start to pay a little bit of attention to these things, one way or another, you start to have to choose between what is right and what is not. In terms of this kind of consensus trance, where we all have accepted that the rope is a snake, that the body is of a particular nationality, there's this idea that just a little bit of analysis of that, if we ever begin to doubt, for whatever reason, that this is true, that we are these things that we identify with, it has an effect. And the effect is that this whole thing starts to become unraveled. And this is sort of the road and the path that leads toward a particular type of enlightenment. And I guess that's, well, that's about what I have on nothingness for tonight. It's an awful lot can be said about nothing.
Thank you very much. Would you take questions?
Certainly.
Now then, are there any questions from the live audience? Very good.
Thank you. That was very, very good. If we're sitting here and we're wondering, you know, is there anything that I'm looking at that's real or anything I'm thinking, can you suggest anything that we could do daily that could just, where we kind of put aside a little bit and maybe look at that? Can you make any suggestions that could just maybe help us a little bit if we maybe took some time? Or
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that, I mean, very often we tend, even when we look at each other, what we look at is, if I'm talking to you, I'm going to look at the space that your body occupies. And I'll end up calling that Diane. One of the things that's also possible to do is to try and become aware of the there's spaces between us. And if you really pay attention to it, you're aware that that space has a particular shape and a particular quality to it. And in a sense, really the space that's around us is really what defines what we're looking at. So if we can become aware of the spaces, when you look at a tree, we'll focus on the leaf, we'll focus on the branch. But between all of that, there's really the thing that defines those things is the space that's there, but we don't lend any attention to that. And really, if we were to do that, you'd find that really this is the thing that you feel a sense of connection. You start to become aware of a different quality of relationship when you do that. And you can do that as just a little exercise or meditation. It's a way of shifting the way that we see things so that perhaps our vision becomes different and maybe even fuller. That's just an exercise.
One other question over here.
So you're talking about the way, I like that answer, but leading up, because you talked about families and the identities that we develop from families, and families play such an important role in so many people's lives. Is there some way to one, stop from identifying the way your families might view you, because that, I think, is the core of everything, and then outward society, or two, maybe change the way they view things, or should we even try?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
Throw me that, Batman.
I mean, at a certain point, obviously your ability to control the behavior of someone else is limited. You can control, to some degree, your own behavior, but you can actually try and do something to kind of shift the way you see it. There are family roles that become accepted. And when we're in families, we find ourselves, oftentimes people be away from home for years and come back, and then all of a sudden they're back into the same arguments, the same discussions as they had when they were kids. And I think in many ways, part of what it is that we haven't really examined these ideas that we've taken on. And we take them as very solid and real things. And we behave as if they are solid and real. If you ever really doubted that you were, that all of this that you had taken on was who you are, you'd start to think very differently. There was a book that came out many, many years ago. This guy decided, this is back during time of the civil rights era. And he decided that he really wanted to find out what it was like. He hears all these things about racial discrimination and all that. And, he was a guy with a family, a regular sort of middle-class guy up in the north. And he decided he was going to find out what it was like. So he did some sort of thing with dye, where he dyed himself so he looked like he was African American. And he went down south. Yet black like me, that was the book. And then he describes all of these experiences that he had. Now, the same person, as he was in Michigan or wherever it was he came from, but suddenly his whole experience was different. His whole way of regarding the people he was interacting with was different. He found himself staying off the streets at certain times because he knew he didn't want to be in certain places that would have been normal. When he went into a grocery store, he behaved different. So he came away with this idea, in a very graphic sense, that these identities they're real because they're accepted. And when you ever start to question that, you start to find that the whole thing it gets a little bit looser, and it makes it possible to live in a way that's perhaps a little bit more free, if you ever start to ask those questions. So, that's one way you can interact with family, friends, and yourself, mainly. Yeah.
I think we have a question from online. Where is it? Boy, that's tiny. Okay. I don't know that I'll try and read this very small script. Is the real essence the soul? Do we find connection through the soul? Is that it?
That's it?
That's it. And it was very small.
Right, right. So, yeah, I mean, a lot of this, of course, will depend on what your tradition is and what we might mean by soul. In the Theosophical tradition, when you talk about soul, you're talking about something that's described as Atma, Buddhi, Manas. The spiritual, you could say, essence, Buddhi, which is the intuition and the higher mind. And that's the thing that survives from life to life. That basically it inhabits one body, that body dies, it extracts the experiences of that lifetime, distills it, and then the cycle begins again. So, to the extent that we can talk about the essence of that we have, that would be it. But I think in some sense, it's easy to misinterpret. H.P. Blavatsky, in talking about the reason for founding the Theosophical Society, there's a little document she wrote called The Original Program of the Theosophical Society. And in it she says that the founders of the society had to exert every effort to oppose all forms of selfishness. So when we think selfishness, I mean, very often we think in terms of just trying to get the last piece of pie or, simple sorts of things. But it's also, I think, a much deeper idea, because very often when we think in terms of who I am, we can peel these pieces back and maybe we can get to the point where we say, I'm not the body, I'm not the emotions, I'm not the mind, I am the soul. And I think very often, for many of us, that can be just a new and perhaps elevated form of selfishness. That now, instead of this body that's going to die, now I've got something that's going to be around all the time. And it's basically me, this guy's standing up here, and it's going to keep coming back. It's permanent. And I think probably she was trying to do things to actually influence that way of thinking as well. That perhaps there's more to it than just that. So certainly there is, you could say there is something that incarnates, that has this spiritual essence to it. But to think of that as the permanent and the last stop, then maybe there's more to it. And maybe she was trying to suggest that.
Another question from online. Oh, thank you. That's much easier to read.
John, you need your reading glasses.
I've got them on. Okay, here it is. Is your meaning that when the young child is born and has no identity, does this mean that the child has great wisdom? If this is true, what is the purpose of having identity?
Well, I think probably in most, you always hear in many spiritual traditions, they talk about how the quality of being childlike is something to be admired, or something that is a quality that we should pursue. And I think that's because there's this quality of innocence. Something that is more immediately in touch with this kind of unclouded view of who I am. Very often the thing that characterizes children is spontaneity. They're uninhibited, and they're spontaneous, and they're free. And very often they'll bring in ideas about, they can talk to you about things that are of a spiritual nature, or, all those sorts of things we admire in children. And so there is that sort of a wisdom that often gets crowded out very quickly. I think one of the purposes, I mean, if you want to think in terms of a purpose of identity, I don't know that it necessarily has to be so purposeful. It happens. I mean, it's the nature of consciousness that we tend to identify with that which we associate. So we identify with the bodies. But I think one of the effects of identity is that it makes us have to work a little bit harder. I mean, they say once you find yourself in a hole, the first thing you should do is stop digging. With us, once you find yourself feeling trapped and feeling worried and feeling, that all of these different things have closed in on you, then probably the first thing we can do is stop and maybe examine. Take a look at it. If you're in a hole, you want to figure out how to get out of it. And so one of the ways of getting out of it, of course, is these various means that have been suggested, that to be absent from the body is to be present with the divine. That we create this vacuum. They say nature abhors a vacuum. So as we start to remove these layers through just basic examination, you ask yourself a question and wait for the answer. Am I really male? Am I a theosophist? I'm the president of the society here now. Am I president? And as you peel these things away, you start to find, well, maybe not. There is no essential president in here. There is no essential American. There is no essential any of these things. And you peel it away. And as you start to ask these questions, you find that there's almost nothing you can point to that will hold up under this type of scrutiny. And so what that does, if you're going to say that there's a purpose to it, the purpose might be to discover that it's there and then to move beyond it. And what that does not mean is that, once you discover these things, you stop doing everything that you did before. All of a sudden I realize who I am, so now I don't have to go to work. It doesn't work that way. Everything that you did before, you still do. But you do it in a different way. I mean, in the sense that you can have some sense of freedom. You can have some sense that if somebody calls you a name or cuts you off in traffic, you don't have to respond immediately by calling them those various names that come up in your mind. It's not all that, as my daughter would say. So, I think that's that's an effect of identification, but perhaps not a purpose.
Do you have a question? I'll bring the microphone to you so that we can all hear it. Even though you sound like you've got a very loud voice.
So one of the questions would be is, should we value anything? And if we value traits and qualities versus possessions, isn't that still just another label?
Well, it could be. What you could end up saying is you should recognize that everything is kind of empty in this way, but that you should value everything. It makes it so much easier to value. When I look at the people who have, I know a number of people who have had these near-death experiences. And it's amazing because having lost everything and having realized that this personality, this body, none of it has any sort of permanence or reality. They've stepped away from it, they've died. When I look at those people, they're the ones who come back and seem to treasure it all even more. They treat this life in a way as if it is something very, very important, even knowing that it isn't, and that it's really just something that's a shadow and that blocks them from some sort of higher life that they didn't even want to leave when they had to come back. So, all of these traits, all of the qualities that we have, we can value all of that. I mean, it's what makes you the unique person that you are. And it's what makes it possible for this divine to express in a way that it can't be expressed through anyone else. And so when you start to see it that way, then it has a value, but it doesn't hold you anymore. If that speaks to the question.
Yes.
You made an interesting statement at the very beginning, and you said that Jesus tried to teach people to forget the self. Mm-hmm. Can you be more concrete instead of abstract as to what was he implying there? What did he want people to do, basically, or become?
Well, I mean, as I understand it again, in some of the things he said, when you talk about Jesus and the Christ life that he exhibited, he said things like, I and the Father are one. And, he came from a tradition where they said things like, in the Psalms, unless the Lord builds the house, they labor in vain that build it. And things like, the earth is the Lord's, and the fullness of it, and everybody that lives therein. So the idea is, I think it's to diminish the sense of self by recognizing that you participate in this greater life that they call God, that is everything. It is all the Lord's and the fullness of that, and everybody that dwells there is part of the Lord in this particular psalm. And so to try and live that, it begins in simple ways. If that's true, then you start to ask yourself, how should I behave? And then, you get into these things of like, do unto your neighbor, the more basic kind of teachings. Because there's a natural connection there. And it's not a connection of like one body to another in that case. It's a connection of, much like you see, some people use the example of, an ocean. And on top of the ocean, there are countless waves. The waves aren't in any way separate from the body of water that they appear on. But it just looks that way. So for us, as human beings, we tend to look, you're in that seat, you're in that body. You're that wave, and you're different from me. But the idea of the ground that we all spring from is this one source. And if we can recognize that, then you behave differently. In Islam, the meaning of Islam is submission. And it all comes out of these same traditions. Islam comes out of Judaism. Christianity comes out of Judaism. They all have the same thing that traces back to Abraham. But the whole idea there is that, the purpose of being human is to learn this deep lesson of how to submit yourself. Basically, how the wave can become aware of its oneness with this ocean that supports it, which they call Allah. And that's this process that we engage in. It's very helpful. I think one of the things that we get from the various spiritual traditions is that they give these sorts of signposts and a sort of bigger view that allows us to follow that, try it out, see if it works. We've got the greatest laboratory you could ask for, which is just us. You can try it out in your thoughts. See if trying to send a loving thought to someone has an effect. If it does, you can say, that experiment worked. Let me try another one. And you can go on and on and on, and eventually you'll get to this point where you start to recognize that a lot of these very deep things that people said are actually true. And now I can dive in and try and live from this basis. That make sense?
Well, my friends, do you have any remaining questions? One more. Okay.
The internet is alive and hopefully well.
This one is from online. Does the Bodhisattva vow to renounce individual salvation until all are redeemed provide insight into the nature of our true identity or lack thereof?
Is that for me or you, John?
I think it definitely had a big T for Tim on the front of it.
Does the Bodhisattva vow have, your memory of that is what?
Does the Bodhisattva vow help us transcend?
To renounce individual salvation, provide insight to the nature of our true identity, which is or lack thereof true identity.
Yeah. Yeah, the Bodhisattva vow to renounce individual salvation for the benefit of all sentient beings does in fact provide insight in the sense that it's a statement of the nature of reality. So if in fact there are all sentient beings, and if in fact there is such a thing as enlightenment, then it's something that one aspires to for the good that it can do for others. And so I think that's a very profound insight.
I have one last question, and the questioner has been trying to get my attention all this time. And I just thought she was waving to me.
John gets a lot of that. That's why Christine's sitting right here in the front row watching him.
No, it's a question whose time has come, because I think it brings us full circle. Because just a line of a song, you were talking about love songs at the beginning of your talk, and something that comes to mind is me and Bobby McGee. And freedom's just another word for nothing left to lose. And nothing's what Bobby left me. And I think that
Very good.
I think that says it all. I mean, your talk just brought that to mind. So was it?
Should have sung that in the beginning. You're going to help me out.
We should have.
Thank you for that. Yeah.